Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of WION-VOA Co-Production. I'm Susan Tehrani, coming to you live from New York City. We begin with the U.S. Secretary of State's shuttle diplomacy on the war in Ukraine and the escalating conflict in Gaza. Secretary Antony Blinken plans to go to France and Belgium next week to enhance unity among close U.S. allies in their support for Ukraine in the war against Russia and for Israel in its war against Hamas militants. Analysts say he faces a tough task. VOA's Cindy Sain reports.
Russia struck the northeastern Ukrainian city of Kharkiv with aerial bombs Wednesday for the first time since 2022, killing at least one civilian and wounding 16 others and causing widespread damage. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is heading to Europe next week to cement support for Ukraine, as the State Department announced.
Secretary Blinken will travel to Paris, France, and Brussels and Leuven, Belgium, April 1st to 5th to underscore our commitment to the NATO alliance, strengthening transatlantic partnerships, and addressing global challenges. In Paris, Secretary Blinken will meet with French President Macron to discuss support for Ukraine, efforts to prevent escalation of the conflict in Gaza, and a number of other important issues.
French President Emmanuel Macron stirred up a controversy last month by saying that it is imperative that Russia be defeated and that it should not be ruled out that the West may need to send ground troops into Ukraine, a suggestion the U.S. and Germany swiftly rejected. One expert told VOA that he believes Macron was expressing the view, often expressed by the U.S., that all options are possible, without meaning troops would be deployed in Ukraine anytime soon.
We're in a tougher moment in terms of the war in Ukraine, and it is imposing new challenges and new risks for escalation. In some ways, the United States and France are the most outspoken and the most forward-leaning on the question of support for Ukraine across the Atlantic. So there's every reason for us to be on the same page, but I think that meeting with President Macron will certainly be very important to codify that.
Meanwhile, Blinken will head to Europe next week as outrage there and elsewhere grows over the suffering of Palestinian civilians in Gaza due to Israel's war against the U.S.-designated terrorist group Hamas. Another expert told VOA that in Paris and Brussels, Blinken will likely face the complex task of having to listen to and reassure allies while maintaining support for Israel's right to defend itself.
He's going to have to articulate strong support for Israel. I think Biden has been unambiguous on that point, but at the same time be sensitive to some of the concerns that Europeans have in particular about Israel going too far, or Israel not having a long-term strategy, or of Israel engaging in human rights abuses in Gaza.
Another discussion top for Blinken and his counterparts is likely to be the terrorist threat posed by the Islamic State group, which claimed responsibility for the attack last week on a concert in Moscow. The U.S. dismissed as propaganda charges by Russian officials that Ukraine was involved in the attack. Cindy Sain, VOA News.
Okay, VOA's Chris Casquejo is joining us with additional reporting. He's live at the White House. Chris, good to see you, and thank you for joining us. Paris and Washington seem to not be aligned on their approaches to Gaza. How does this impact the global response to the crisis there?
Good morning from Washington, D.C., Susan. While there's definitely tension and division among these two traditional allies, France has advocated for a permanent ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, while the U.S. is calling for a temporary ceasefire during Ramadan. Earlier this week, Washington abstained from that UN Security Council resolution vote calling for that temporary pause, and the resolution passed. The U.S. decision not to veto that resolution caused a chain reaction in Israel, which was supposed to send a delegation here to Washington, D.C. this week to discuss its plans for the ground invasion in Rafah, where 1.5 million Palestinian civilians are sheltering. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu canceled that visit in reaction to the U.S. abstention at the UN Security Council vote, but now has asked for this meeting to be rescheduled. French President Emmanuel Macron told Netanyahu earlier this week that he opposes any military operation in Rafah. Back to you.
Chris, has the U.S. managed to convince Israel not to conduct the Rafah operations?
So far, Washington is not using its military aid leverage to dictate Israel's next steps in Gaza, and there's no evidence that this is going to change. But U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin met with his Israeli counterpart, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, this week. Austin asked him to allow more humanitarian assistance into Gaza to avoid famine. In turn, Gallant asked the U.S. to provide more weapons to Israel. Now, the U.S. already provides $4 billion annually to Israel in weapons. $3.3 billion of that must be used to purchase U.S. weapons. Susan?
For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.